Sometimes, it's not time that heals all wounds, but flowers, steeped gently into a cup of tea. Inspired by founder Lisa Lee's own healing journey from thyroid disease and burnout, the Chi is a wellness brand based in New York City on a mission to help people feel more joy, calm, and connection through the power and beauty of flowering teas. The Chi was born from the discovery of rare, single-origin whole flower teas rooted in centuries-old Eastern rituals. Each bloom is hand-picked at peak vitality by small family-owned farms across Asia to offer a grounding, sensorial experience that reconnects you to yourself, one cup at a time. Choose from the Shangri-La Rose, Blue Lotus, and the Royal Chrysanthemum and get 15% off at the-chi.com. That's the-qy.com with the code FRANZ. That's FRANZ. One-time use and cannot be combined with other codes. Drink flowers, feel alive. Imagine if skincare could do more, but with less. Meet Remsen, a New York brand made in South Korea, where world-leading innovation meets the no-nonsense energy of New York City. Their essential duo keeps it effective and efficient with high-quality ingredients. Their Gentle Greens cleanser, featuring green tea, centella, and aloe, cleanses without drying. And the multitasking peptide moisturizer combines bakuchiol, ceramides, and a clinically proven dose of peptides in a single lightweight step to hydrate, strengthen the skin barrier, and help prevent visible signs of aging. Both are safe for sensitive and acne-prone skin types, vegan, cruelty-free, and beautifully packaged with sustainable materials, making the set a great gift. You can get 20% off your first purchase on remsenskincare.com. That's REMSEN skincare.com with the code FRANZ. That's FRANZ. One-time use and cannot be combined with other codes. Get maximal results with minimal steps. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Friends of Franz podcast, where it's literally just a space where we can all connect and have a conversation about often misunderstood topics within the domains of science and medicine and healthcare and even within the wellness space. One of the conversations that I'm so excited and kind of nervous to talk about is the conversation that we're going to have today. It's very taboo, but I think it's such an important conversation to have because I do believe that when we don't talk about certain things, that's when misinformation arises. And I always say, even when I was doing my content during working throughout COVID times, misinformation can cost lives. So I think it's so important that we talk about many things and all the things. And I'm so excited to have not one, but two amazing people, two amazing friends with me today to talk about a very, very special and very interesting topic. I have Kimmy and Dr. Willy here. Can you please introduce yourselves for our audience?
Sure. Hi. Thank you. My name is Willy. I'm a pelvic health physical therapist based out of Los Angeles, and I studied at Cal State Northridge for both my undergrad in kinesiology and then for grad school for physical therapy. And I always knew I wanted to pursue pelvic health. I'm getting into PT school even. I had a great mentor who introduced it to me. And so I have a huge passion for treating sexual dysfunctions, especially catering towards the queer and underserved communities, which also includes men's health in the pelvic floor spectrum.
Thanks, Chrissy, for the introduction. My name is Kimmy. I am a cis, straight, female, Taiwanese American psychotherapist and sex therapist here in New York City. Before moving to New York as a therapist, I've lived in DC and Florida and also Taiwan. And I received my master's in clinical mental health counseling at Northwestern University. And as a therapist here in New York, some of the issues that I help folks navigate include life transitions, anxiety, depression, perfectionism, relationship issues, and of course, sexual issues. And I guess beside my role as a therapist, I'm also currently founding a startup that aims to build a tool to help people deepen their relationships and create more meaningful ones with not just each other, but also with themselves.
Yes, if I am not with the best of the best right now, I am so honored to have you both on. So I guess people can gather from now, our audience can gather that we're going to talk about this very special topic of sex and sexual health. And I think that's a very condensed version of what our whole conversation will be about today. I believe it was my second season of the podcast. I had an episode with Dr. Fenwa Millhouse, who is a board certified urologic surgeon, especially within pelvic reconstructive surgery. And she talked a lot about sexual dysfunctions and the issues that the general public may have that people don't want to talk about or are ashamed to admit that they have or don't even know how to open up to their providers, their healthcare providers, right? And we really talked about the very clinical and surgical aspect of it. But then I realized that there is a twin and intertwined sister of this conversation, which is the concept of sex in itself and sexual health, right? And I love that we have a convergence of both the clinical and also the psychological and the mental health aspect of this very important topic. Well, let's get right into it. The topic of sex as a whole and even sexual health, it remains to be a very taboo topic worldwide. I mean, I grew up in a very conservative Christian Filipino home, and even now, as a 28-year-old, just thinking of me, like imagining me sitting down with my mom or my family and opening up the topic of sex, I feel like the heavens are gonna fall down on me. And I think this is a very true amongst certain cultures, especially I believe within our Asian culture, right? Why do you think the topic of sex is so taboo in our society as a whole, and especially within our Asian culture? And why do you think it's so important to talk about this very taboo topic? And why is it so important that we break down the taboo regarding this topic? I think let's start with Kimmy.
Sure. I think this is such an important question. And I guess just self-disclosing a little bit, I too came from a pretty conservative Christian family background. So the experience you shared, Chrissy, about feeling maybe a little bit of unease or discomfort around talking about sexuality with family members and sometimes even just within our inner circles of people is one that's not uncommon. But, I guess before I dive in on my more professional thoughts, I want to introduce a term that I might use throughout this episode called the sexual script. So essentially, the sexual script is a set of, I guess, socially learned norms that each of us have. These include some of the expectations and also behaviors that guide how, we perceive, experience, or engage in sexual thoughts and activities. These scripts really shape our understanding of what is quote unquote normal or quote unquote appropriate when it comes to sex. And this really influences everything from who initiates sex, how desire is expressed, what counts as an acceptable sexual encounter, etc. And every single one of us actually has a sexual script of some sort, whether we are sexually active or not. And I think kind of going into your question about, sex remaining such a taboo topic, I think the reason is often this is considered taboo is because of a mix of cultural, religious, and also historical and psychological factors. These factors really all play a role in forming these sexual scripts that as individuals we hold. And I think it's incredibly important to talk about taboos in general and then also talk about sex because even though they're a necessary part of society, there's a lot of negative consequences that taboos can form. So I guess going into, the reason why taboo is here, right? I'm not here to really demonize the concept of taboo because they do exist for positive reasons, including protection, social cohesion, resource efficiency, and moral guidance, and sometimes communication. And some of the more negative consequences when taboos are left unaddressed or not unaddressed at all or not really discussed with any sort of nuance is that they kind of contribute to conflict, to suppression, to negative stereotypes, sometimes misconceptions, and also social stigma, which sex, I think, is a great example of. And I do believe that we need to have more of these conversations about taboos and also sex, because by not talking about it, right, the silence can be so loud sometimes. And, by continuously treating this as like a naughty topic, quote unquote, that we're just not supposed to talk about, we're really perpetuating it as something that is abnormal and wrong. And I think really encouraging open dialogues about taboos and about topics like sex can really legitimize and raise awareness to marginalized experiences, which I know we'll touch on later on in this episode, and also encourage individuals to pursue more self-discovery and personal growth around these topics. And it also can allow us to explore more diverse perspectives, and that helps us cultivate more empathy amongst those of us who have different beliefs and lived experiences. And by doing that, I really do believe that this can help us foster deeper understanding and even greater tolerance when it comes to having differences of opinions and experiences within our community.
Yeah, I super agree with that. Thank you for all of that information. I mean, it's a very complex topic, right? It's not really just one thing that you can deduce to one concept and all those emotions that I feel when I think based on my background. Like, imagine me sitting down with my mom and be like, I just had, oh my gosh. Like, I literally feel like lightning will strike out from the skies. And like, I would wish lightning would strike out from the skies and just vaporize me in that moment, right? I think that visceral reaction is a testament to, I guess, how important culture is when it comes to creating the person who we are, right? And why our worldviews and why our perspective about life matters so much based on what our environment, right? And how we grew up. And I wanted to direct the next question to Willy, actually, because when speaking about society, definitely, as we said, the topic of sex and sexual health remains to be taboo. But I think especially within the clinical space, right? I'm very, very intrigued actually to find that it still remains to be also a taboo topic within healthcare in itself. I had my annual PCP appointment, primary care appointment, a few months ago. And it took me a while to get an appointment because America was going on with this PCP appointment to 1 year from now. Thank you, insurance companies. So I'm getting my comprehensive health assessment. And obviously in the intake form, to ask like, what's your orientation? Like, who do you sleep with? And so my primary care physician was like, oh, we should do some testing. And I remember just being there like, oh yeah, I can do testing. And I am a nurse. And obviously I've gone through school and I see this every day. Even I was like, yeah. Even when he'd ask me like questions that I never thought a doctor would ask, like, are you top? Are you bottom? Do you this? Do you this? I was like, yeah. I guess my point is even within the confines of medical offices where it's supposed to be a safe space, and sexual health is supposed to be part of the comprehensive health assessment, it can still be a very sensitive and awkward topic. One, if it is brought up by the clinician, right? Many clinicians gloss over the sexual portion of the social history. Well, I want to ask Willy specifically, within the clinical aspect, how do you think clinicians should approach this topic to make, one, the patient comfortable, and also at the same time, back to what Kimmy said, is breaking down that taboo around this conversation?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I think, like you said, it might be uncomfortable on the patient's perspective to bring up these conversation, especially if they feel distant or uncomfortable with the provider. Maybe it's the first time seeing them. And so I think it just starts with normalizing the conversation. I think clinicians should include screening sexual health as a part of overall health and well-being because it can be a major contributor to one's quality of life. I think it starts with creating a judgment-free and safe zone, can let the patients know that this is a standard, questions. And if they're uncomfortable with answering it, they can always bring it up at a later time, but just bringing it up, and you have to sound comfortable with it yourself. You can't be like, so what are you doing with your intimate life? You just roll through it like you're at any other questions. And I think they'll feel more comfortable with that as well.
Curious, in that you do specialize within pelvic health, and the pelvic area is basically where all the magic happens, right? In this sphere, in this domain of what we're talking about. I'm curious, how do your patients present to you? How's their disposition when they're trying to share that, yeah, I have a problem with this or with that? How do they sound? Like, how do they present it? And how do you as the clinician clinician, I guess, approach that sense of, oh, I'm scared, I'm trying to be vulnerable here?
Yeah, you can often see a patient exhibiting more like reserved expressions. They might not be making eye contact, their voice might be low, they might hesitate to answer some questions. And so that's where you step in and, let them know you don't have to answer any of these if you're uncomfortable, but this is an important part for us to know more about your pelvic health overall. So I asked them questions about their bladder, their bowel history, but also sexual history, because it's important to me to be able to know what kind of goals we might want to set for them. And we can always address it at a later time, I tell them.
I love that. Yeah. There's two parts to this conversation, right? Within the clinician office. One, definitely the acknowledgement from the patient, right? Where, I do have a problem. I think that's always the first step. But I think sometimes the acknowledgement from the patient is kind of hindered by many things. One is, again, the shame and the discomfort of opening up something so vulnerable about themselves where technically no one sees that in a daily life, right? But I think a very common reason why there's also a hindrance to the acknowledgement is the fear of, what if my clinician judges me? And I wanted to direct this section to Kimmy. You mentioned once before during our introductory call regarding the concept of bias from clinicians, from therapists. Can you talk more about that, and how vital is it when it comes to patients who are trying to be vulnerable and seeking help when it comes to their sexual health and also their dysfunctions that we'll talk about later on?
Yeah, no, that's such a good question. So, I fully believe that nobody can truly be completely bias free. That is a very human thing, right? Like, we all have different lived experiences and different beliefs about how the world works and what roles we play and etc. And I think, it's impossible to not have any sort of bias, but at the same time, as a therapist, that's a big part of what we are challenged to do, as in challenging our own biases and our own opinions, and also learning how to keep that outside of the clinical space when it comes to therapy. Of course, sometimes we may have all kinds of reactions, and it's not just about sex, right? It's about anything that a client could bring into a therapy session. It's incredibly important that as clinicians, not just therapists, but any sort of service provider, to really understand that, sometimes our reactions are not actually welcome in the space, right? This is our own stuff that we should be processing outside of therapy, or maybe even in our own therapy sessions with our therapist. And also, there's another piece of this where I would encourage, if there's any sense of judgment that we feel as the patient or the client in this space, that maybe we name that and call it out, right? And what it can sound like is, hey, I know that we're working on establishing a safe space within this therapy session or within this clinical space, but there's a part of me that's feeling a little uncomfortable and at unease about, what we're currently talking about. And I'm almost feeling a little bit judged and, kind of offering it up to be a conversation to be had about that.
Yeah, definitely. I was doing my mandated reporter renewal certification the other day, where it took us 3 days on the computer, which is so important, right? And my coworker was also doing the renewal, and she texted us a picture from the post-test. This is the post-test question. Everyone, including you, has biases. True or false? And we were all like, this feels a little aggressive, but it's true.
Yes.
Everyone, including us, do have biases, right? And I think that stems even from society as a whole, right? Even the concept of taboo as a whole, right? I think aspect of why something becomes a taboo is also because of bias, right? And that's obviously amalgamation of society and personal beliefs and cultural aspects. And I think that help form our attitudes and society's attitude towards sex and the topic of sexual health. According to the National Institutes of Health, they had a 2023 article where they said that the most common sources of sexual information are parents, peers, television, movies, and social media. but only learning from television were associated with sex-positive scripts among emerging adults. Which is so interesting to me, right? That the most sex-positive perception and attitudes towards sex is from television. I don't know how true that is now or how true it was when we were kids. Well, I guess when you think of famous TV shows where they show a lot of sex scenes, sure. But it's very interesting that the NIH article concluded that there was more sex positivity coming from television and media as opposed to our parents, peers, and our inner circle, right? We touched upon this during our first question of the uneasiness coming from that thought of even having a conversation with our loved ones regarding the topic of sex. How do you think the world can be more accepting, especially our inner circle, when it comes to sex positivity? And I guess especially now in our current times, how about kids who are learning about their sexuality, right?
I think it starts with being able to address our perception of sex. What is considered normal sex? Is it always penetrative? Is it just intimacy? Is it masturbation? I think depending on the person, there's no one form. And so I think television is good and maybe expressing some hopefully consensual, healthier interactions with people. Yeah, just knowing what's normal for you or what's okay for you. Maybe we shouldn't use the word normal, but what's pleasurable for you? What feels good for you? What fulfills you, might be a healthier way to look at sex and defining what it is. I think a lot of folks use pornography as a learning tool, and that becomes their reference for when they engage in sexual encounters. And that can be unhealthy in itself too. And so that's maybe their frame of learning things because parents don't talk about it. And, what you learn in school is very biological,
The
very
birds and the
functional.
bees.
Yeah, I think being able to discuss with your friends even, because I know my parents never discussed anything sexual or birds and bees. I never had that talk. I don't know
Me
what that
too.
is. So, yeah, I think just talking with your friends, or even I have patients who get like bottom shamed or what have you with their friends when they talk about like, oh, I'm having pain with this. And they just like make fun of them. And it's like, no, we should like open up the discussion and kind of address it as being an issue, if someone's having a problem. So,
Yeah, that's the title of this podcast.
Yeah.
No to bottom shaming.
let's end bottom shaming.
First of all, they do all the work. Just kidding. I'm
Yeah.
curious, Kimmy, what's your thoughts on this
Yeah.
topic?
No, I mean, I think Willy covered such important points. And I actually was just like thinking about the talk for me and what that was like with my mom, who actually happens to be an OBGYN. So it was very the birds and the bees, like very biological. And, I'm as an adult, think back at, why was sex framed in this way? And I think, that we have to acknowledge that sex is often framed around danger and consequences, right? We think about STD, we think about pregnancy. And then I think coming from a Christian background, morality is a big one when it comes to premarital sex, And rather than talking about pleasure, agency, and communication, there can also be a lot of generational cycle of shame and silencing that's really contributing it. That makes it so, well, let's talk about the scientific rather than how sex is supposed to make you feel, etc. And I'm also thinking, I think there's a lot of maybe fear of encouraging sex because, we deem it as a risky behavior. Because I think maybe parents and guardians sometimes might believe that if we talk about sex too openly or too much, that it somehow encourages it. When in reality, actually, research suggests otherwise. I think by openly really talking about sex actually can help children and teens have better relationship with sex as a concept and also their own sexuality so that actually can help them make more informed decisions for themselves. And I think just with all that being said, I would like to propose that, folks, whether you're a parent or a friend or a sibling or a mentor of any sort, that we start to normalize age appropriate and ongoing conversations around sex and relationship. I know that's what Willy kind of already touched on. And also really encourage pleasure-based and also consent-driven discussion. Because I think, those are the only ways we can talk about sex in a way that really is more focused on the self rather than having to please some sort of norm or, what you said about, let's stop talking about it as normal, but in fact, like what feels good, right? What about sex makes us feel good about ourselves and feel good with our partners, etc. And the last thing is, how do we also as a society and as an individual challenge harmful script that promotes these shame or fears on sex, right? About sex, and actually have more educational and positive and accurate information about sex within our inner circles.
Yeah, I love all of those points. The only thing running in my mind right now when you're talking about fear-based conversations around sex is that scene from Mean Girls where, was it the gym teacher? It's like, don't have sex, kids. I just have STDs on the board. I was like, basically, that's how the society is, right?
Just gonna say, I also remember watching or seeing memes of I think it was an Asian dad that's like, don't have sex until marriage, don't have sex until you're dead, or whatever. And I think it's interesting, especially in a clinical sense. I work with clients who, have never had any sort of sexual experiences, not just with other people. People have never masturbated or never even thought about what sex can mean for them. And then they get married and realize they know nothing about sex for themselves. And that can really cause some long-term consequences for an individual's sexual self and also for their relationship.
We long for what's natural, yet often hide it with layers. And today's soap market is no different, crowded with products that are harsh and overly processed. Born in Seoul, South Korea, Chai Binu was made to bring things back to something simpler, something intentional. Each handcrafted bar of soap is cold processed in small batches, using only natural oils and botanical powders. It is then cured and air-dried for over 1,000 hours, letting the bar harden naturally for a gentler feel and a longer life. It all began with a mother searching for relief for her son's sensitive skin and her refusal to settle for harsh liquid soaps or quick-made bars. Let your skin experience the byproduct of patience, simplicity, and a mother's love for 15% off at shybinu.com. That's shybinu.com with the code FRANZ. That's FRANZ. What if your night out could come with a smarter tomorrow? Meet Dayguard, a Korean-inspired functional jelly stick designed to support liver health, hydration, gut balance, and vitamin replenishment when drinking alcohol. With science-backed ingredients like DHM, L-cysteine, prickly pear extract, L-arginine, and B vitamins, each convenient and delicious stick helps your body break down alcohol and reduce next day sluggishness. Just take one stick before your first drink of the night and support your body's natural recovery so you can wake up refreshed. Get 10% off your first purchase at dayguard.com, that's DAYGUARD.com, with the code FRANZ, that's FRANZ. One-time use and cannot be combined with other codes. I wanted to delve deeper into that sexual health. And I think this specific portion of our conversation is very important. And I think this is the crux of our conversation because this is the convergence of both of your specialties, right? From both the clinical and more the psychotherapist aspects. The context of specifically shame and stress regarding this functions within the sexual realm, right? You're right. Sex in itself and sexual health in itself is a taboo topic already in its own, and it's filled with a lot of shame and discomfort. But when you add an extra layer of dysfunction within, whether it's a physiological or from the mental or even from an emotional space, right? It adds that even more gravity and weight on the person carrying it. A year or so ago, I went to dinner with a friend of mine, and she told me that she was once in a relationship or she was with her partner for a while, but they didn't engage in sex because it was always so painful and they weren't sure if they should seek help medically. And this is something that obviously I learned about in nursing school as well, is the persistent pain during sexual intercourse. For this portion of our conversation, I would love to hear Willy's clinical aspect, and then I want to hear from Kimmy as well, from your psychotherapist aspect, because I know your specialties refer within each other. With our first topic of persistent pain during sexual intercourse, is this normal? And how does this dysfunction affect the quality of life and even the psyche of the person who is going through it, right? And I guess, how does each of your profession approach this?
Yeah, so painful sex in the vaginal canal specifically is dyspareunia, and it's incredibly common, unfortunately. However, not normal. I think it's normalized because a lot of women or vagina owners might think that's part of the process. That's all they've ever known. They don't bring it up with anyone. So that's their perception of sex. And unfortunately, many of them kind of just live with it and bear with it. It is very treatable, but yeah, just due to shame, misinformation, a lot of folks don't seek help. Also, anal dyspareunia, that's painful receptive anal intercourse, is very common, and it doesn't include only the queer population. I think in COVID, there was some studies that came out that a lot of straight men started engaging more in anal play, with all that downtime or whatever. And so that might be something that arises that's a little more common too for anybody. So it is very common. I think in one of my courses for pelvic floor, there were a lot of women there, and the instructor asked if they've ever had painful sex, and almost everyone's hand, was raised. And it kind of shocked me too, starting out, because I didn't really know that. And that's kind of speaks volumes that wow, this is super common. It's super treatable. And people live their whole lives not seeking treatment and being okay, so let me just, I don't know, take some painkillers, take some wine or something beforehand. It's really something that I'm passionate about kind of dispelling. It can interrupt the sex itself or prevent sex from occurring. And I think it also falls on the lap of your partners as well to be educated, to be communicative and receptive to working with the person who's having pain, and just seeking ways or other ways, maybe in the interim, to find pleasure for both parties.
And is this pain deriving from more usually anatomical aspect? Is it from the physiology itself? And what's the common treatments that you do within your sphere?
Yeah, so in terms of dyspareunia, it could be entrance dyspareunia. So just when you're entering the vaginal canal having pain, or it could be deep dyspareunia. So deeper pressures that occur. And oftentimes it could be due to stiff musculature, spasms of the muscles, vaginismus, things like that. And the pain could be quite severe, lasting hours afterwards. And I'm not a big fan of recommending lubricants with lidocaine, because it can mask pain or maybe even damage that occurs. So we want to just focus on relaxation techniques. Use of dilators can be helpful to help provide some stretching of the musculature there. A lot of deep breathing techniques can often relax the nervous system. So I often recommend patients do self-exploration on their own first. Start recognizing, owning their body parts and seeing how things feel, what might feel tense, what might feel good, and trying to go from there before adding your partner, as a start, unless your partner wants to help too, and that's fine too. But I think learning your own body first, it's kind of like that, if you don't love yourself, who's going to love you kind of speech. I think that was a RuPaul thing, but yeah, so just finding out what works for you, and then you can be more comfortable telling your partners as well. And I think sometimes I tell patients to have an orgasm before having intercourse because it can relax your muscles, So that might be an option for some folks too.
Kimmy, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, thanks, Willy, for breaking all that down. When I think about pain during sexual intercourse, my first response is just the statement that I will keep repeating, which is that intercourse should never, ever hurt. It really should not. And, I think depending on the client who comes in, I think often time really is to first understand their sexual script. Off the top of my head, I think a lot of times, especially vagina owners who struggle with pain during intercourse, there might be this sense of pressure that comes from it, not just the pressure of having intercourse, but the pressure of, feeling like something is broken or inadequate because they experience pain that adds on to that sense of pressure. And this can really impact in so many ways. There's, sometimes I notice lower self-esteem, feeling like something is wrong with them, maybe some sexual identity confusion, feeling like not sure about their sexuality, their desirability, or even what pleasure is to them. And also another thing that I notice is hyper focus on pain, which then again adds on to that pressure. And then therefore you can't really quite relax during sex. So some of the things that I would explore with clients besides the sexual script and how do we break out of, feeling like sex is a bad or naughty thing that you're not supposed to be doing is how do we focus on our bodies besides the pain, right? What are some of the other sensations that can come up, not just during sex, but just having more of an awareness of their bodies and also explore what does outer course look like? Because, when it comes to sexual experiences, it's not just about the P and the V or the P and the A or there's so many ways that we can create a sexually pleasurable experience besides intercourse if that's something that, we're still actively working through. I'm wondering if there's anything that you're curious about, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I remember from our introductory call, which actually was so interesting to me, where he said that asexual people are still sexual. Can you
Yes.
drive that further?
Yeah, because when we talk about sex, a lot of times we just think about sexual intercourse or sexual identity or gender, right? But, when it comes to asexual people as also sexual beings, it's essentially pointing to the fact that even though being asexual means that they don't have certain sexual drives that kind of matches what we deem as normal, quote unquote, in society, it doesn't mean that they don't have a sexual self, right? To me, sex is really about the pleasure, right? And you don't have to be a sexually active person with another person to be a sexual being.
Yes, definitely. And I think that also ties in with what we're talking about, like the outer course aspect, right? Which is actually the first time I've ever heard that term. Super interesting. You're right. It's roots in a lot of self-esteem, right? Especially, when they say that comparison is the thief of joy, right? I'm sure because people don't really talk much about it, but we always have this baseline perception of I'm the only one going through this, right?
Yeah.
I'm the only one who has this problem. And I guess it's so important to know, which is why it's also nice that we're having this conversation where we can share to our audiences that it's much more common than you think, and it does not necessarily mean that it's not wrong, right? It is what it is. We approach it this way, and there's ways to treat it. And I think sometimes the hardest part when you have something or going through something is that thought of, I'm alone. I'm the only one who has it. And I think this also relates to the next dysfunction we're going to talk about, which is very, very common, is pelvic floor prolapse and even erectile dysfunction in itself, right? I remember working inpatient too, where, all our guys are on Viagra. And I'm like, it's very common. I think growing up, I'm like, oh, it's a very rare disease or something, or even prolapse in itself. Well, I think this specifically, especially, this dysfunction warrants a lot of referrals from both of your fields, right? And between referrals. I guess back to Willy, can you tell us more about, I know this is one of your specialties, is pelvic floor or organ prolapse. Like, what is it? How do you approach it? How do you usually treat it? And would love to hear also from Kimmy, because I'm sure you see a lot of clients with this too.
Yeah, absolutely. So pelvic organ prolapse is when one of your organs in your pelvic bowl starts to descend and kind of push against the tissues of the vaginal canal or come out of the rectum itself. So most commonly you'll see like a bladder prolapse come descending into and maybe out of the vaginal canal. And so it can be extremely distressing, it can be uncomfortable, and impede one's sexual life as well. Risk factors usually include multiple pregnancies, you don't even have to deliver, being perimenopausal or postmenopausal, a history of straining, heavy lifting, constipation, as well as any issues during delivery with forceps use or vacuum suction, things like that. and also connective tissue disorders, like when you're hypermobile because you have all that stretchiness to you. And so it is very common, especially in women, and it can obstruct your, again, sexual life, but also being able to void on the toilet because it's literally in the way. So the good news about that, it is also treatable. Pelvic floor therapy can help reduce a prolapse. However, if it is severe, you'll need to get surgery to support those organs up again. But that's why I'm also a big advocate of, if appropriate, a patient pursuing some hormonal replacement therapies, especially for those undergoing menopause or postmenopause with those fluctuations, because those hormones can actually help plump up and support the tissues, strengthen and hypertrophy the musculature down there. So there's a lot of good research going into that. And yeah, there are also pessaries one can use. The ones now you can leave in for quite a while, some of them, and you can still have intercourse with them on. You can exercise with them on, all of that, and you just have to replace them or get them out and cleansed every few months or so. Now, in terms of erectile dysfunction, that's another common condition I'll see where it's extremely distressing to a man because they often link their sexual function to their self-worth. You know, there's a lot of toxic masculinity where they all say, you know, men have to be strong all the time. They have to be, I don't know, aggressive, have their stuff together. And when, you know, a man is struggling with erectile dysfunction, they often feel like less of a man or less adequate or what have you. And so oftentimes, you know, there are different types of causes of ED. It's usually multifactorial. You have to look into one's cardiovascular health, their mental health, hormonal balance, but also in my case, the pelvic floor strength, coordination. And that is where we can help patients achieve stronger, more functional erections. We have two muscles, the bulbar cavernosus and the ischiocavernosus, that can help pump blood into the penile tissues, as well as trap blood into the penile tissues to be able to attain and maintain an erection. And so that's how we can help men's health, as well as working with vacuums, rings that help trap the blood. There's a lot of good research in penile rehab. So yeah.
Yeah. And then I guess before we move on to Kimmy, it's very interesting because, yeah, when we talk about pelvic prolapse, especially within school too, I remember the conversation really revolving around women, right? When it comes to the pelvic floor. But I've seen that from the education that you try to spread online, Willy, is you talk a lot about the pelvic floor in men, which is, I think, a topic that's not really talked about, right? Usually the conversation of the pelvic floor belongs to the women. What can you say about the topic of pelvic floor, which you touched briefly when it comes to the male population?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So I think there's a bit of a divide there. I think, you know, some people say men's health's kind of 20 years behind women's health because even though men have been historically the most researched, the focus has been on them, there's not been a lot as much on men's health, men's sexual health, men's pelvic floor dysfunction. And so I think it's because a lot of people still think pelvic floor dysfunction is a woman's thing, or I've had some doctors that told their patients that, oh, only, you know, Kegels are only for women, you know, things like that, that kind of reinforce the idea that men don't have issues down there or like, and so when someone does have a problem with their pelvic floor, they're so confused, they're distressed, they're like, oh my God, am I dying? So I think I'm really driven to help show men that it's okay that you're going through this. It's common, it's treatable, and everyone has a pelvic floor. And so one can develop issues there. I think the toxic masculinity kind of fuels that a little bit because men don't have that same camaraderie that a lot of women do. Like women, they tend to be more open about telling their friends about their pelvic floor issues, maybe discussing painful sex or just, you know, things like that. But for men, they don't bring that up with other men. And that's what also doesn't spread awareness. It just reinforces that shame.
What if your home could feel more like you? Meet Emmy, a New York-based home fragrance brand founded in 2020 by Erica and Mark. Inspired by the scents they grew up with, like steamed rice, tropical fruits, and temple incense, Emmy celebrates fragrance as memory, culture, and ritual. From design-forward candles to reed diffusers and hand soaps, Each product is crafted with clean ingredients, wood wicks, and thoughtful formulations. More than scent, Emmy creates atmosphere and belonging, storytelling in wax, in water, in air. So whether it's lighting a candle or washing your hands, small rituals are transformed into something intentional, making your space warm, alive, and entirely yours. Get 15% off at emmynyc.com. That's EMMENYC.com with code FRANZ. That's FRANZ. Find your story, find your atmosphere, find it with Emmy. There are trips, and then there are experiences. Imagine a journey where beauty meets meaning. Your K-Beauty Tour is a 7-day, privately curated immersion in South Korea, blending Korean skincare expertise, holistic wellness, and cultural depth, from the trend-setting beauty districts of Seoul to the serene beaches of Busan. Personally hosted by leading beauty and wellness content creator and my dear friend, Daniel Oh, this experience offers access you simply cannot get on your own. From palace courtyards where empresses once prepared their skin with hand-ground herbs, to private aesthetic consultations, bespoke color analysis, exclusive spa therapies, and blue ribbon level dining. With intentionally limited spaces for May 10 to 16, 2026, this is beauty elevated to ritual, where skincare becomes ceremony and travel becomes something unforgettable. Visit yourkbeautytour.com to learn more and reserve your place.
So, I want to be transparent that I haven't really worked with many clients who struggle with pelvic floor prolapse. So I think I'm going to refrain from saying too much about that one. But I do work with men who struggle with erectile dysfunction. It's quite a common, dysfunction that folks tend to seek sex therapy for. And I think there's so many treatment plans that you might find that can be helpful. But really, my first step is always understanding, again, back to the sexual script. And also, I think there's something to be addressed when it comes to men and their relationship with their penis. I recently read a very wonderful book by Dr. Daniel Water called The Existential Importance of the Penis. And it actually just talks about the idea that for many, many men, their penis is not just a sexual organ, but really it's a powerful symbolic representation of their manhood, of their identity, of their self-worth, and also their ability to actually connect with each other. And I think just even giving space to why, having this dysfunction specifically and how that really plays a role in, how a man sees himself can be so incredibly helpful. And some of the other things that I have definitely had to work through with clients who struggle with erectile dysfunction is exploring whether there's any sort of performance anxiety that comes up, and also just processing, kind of the impact of erectile dysfunction. Because, I think with any of these dysfunctions, obviously shame is a big one that comes up. But also there's, with both erectile dysfunction and also painful sex that we talked about, sometimes relationally, this can come up as avoidance of intimacy. And in couples work, as a couples therapist as well, oftentimes is creating a space where couples can talk about why they may be avoiding sex with each other or avoiding intimacy in general. Because sometimes not talking about it just sends a message of, I don't want to have sex with you, which actually isn't really the case sometimes. And that can sometimes feel like rejection, which, may not actually be the case. And some of the other stuff that can come up is depression and also anxiety about wondering if my penis will ever be erect ever again, right? That's an actual existential question for some people to be exploring.
Yeah, definitely. There's a revolving topic around the conversations we're having today, which is that this whole topic of sex and sexual health is multifactorial. It's just not one thing. Like, literally, we can probably record like 10 episodes on this just one thing. There's so many aspects to it. And I feel like society has reduced the conversation to something that's so moralistic and something that's so tabooed and something that's so inhibited. But in fact, it's a very crucial aspect of the human life and the human experience, right? Because whether dysfunction or not, there entails a lot of different human emotions like shame and even like hope and desperation and joy and even even lacking of quality of life and whatnot, right? I'm so grateful to both of you for sharing me with your expertise in answering these questions. These are very complex questions, and we talked about the clinical aspect of it and what happens within our providers' offices or even in our therapist's office and in that very vulnerable space, and how sexual dysfunction affects people's lives and self-esteem and even our inner circle and the sexual script and how the world and society views sex and how they perceive it. As my last question, I do want to ask, what is your personal hope for the domain of sexual health? And I guess, how do you want the world and the public to approach the topic and reality of sex positivity and the pleasure and sex in itself? If your ideal world were to come true, how do you envision it when it comes to the topic of sex?
Yeah, so my hope is that we can create a world where sexual health is an essential part of your normal health and overall health. I would like to see inclusive, evidence-based care for, providers who can feel more comfortable with bringing up sexual topics without them feeling shame or having the patient feel shame. I would like to see healthier sexual representation in the media, being able to have men as well talk to their friends and tell them, oh, I'm having some pain with intercourse, having some erectile dysfunction, and not them feeling like they're going to be judged by their friends or feel like less adequate. So I just want to see a world where we can just bring it up more casually.
Yeah, I think this is such a big question to me. I'm having, a lot of thoughts. But I think just off the top of my head, I hope that we have better sex education, meaning more, inclusive, evidence-based, and also positive research that we use to create educational content around sexuality, because I think it's really missing, right? And very limited. And, by not having proper channels for better sex education, folks start to look for it in places that maybe aren't so inclusive and positive. And another thing as a therapist that I hope is that I really would love to see more mental health clinician learn more about sexual issues, right? Not saying that everybody has to specialize in sex therapy, but, just going to a mental health specialist in general, how do we create a space where folks can talk about and breach, some of the topics around sexuality without having to feel like this is something that only a sex therapist can do? I think lastly, I would want the world and the public to start to approach this topic with curiosity. I think we generally are curious about sex, because I don't think we would be having all these searches on Google incognito mode about sexuality if we weren't. And I think it's very apparent that we have a curiosity, but, not having places to explore our curiosity actually starts to create this shameful, I guess, culture around the topic. And rather than judging, right, having a curious framework around having these conversations can really start to create a more positive environment for this topic.
I love both of what you said. I am so grateful to both of you for opening my eyes also to the subtopics that we talked about today. And again, this can be another topic for another day, but even until now, as I've lived my life and have gotten even away from the shackles of the very conservative background that I had, even until now, I do have my reservations, right? And my uneasiness when it comes to this conversation. But both of you are so inspiring and just letting me know that this is a conversation to be had. It's so important. And the world should be talking about it more, right? And that's how we can promote health and even just a better quality of life when talking about pleasure and just what sex means to me and to the people around me. I loved our conversation today. Kimmy and Willy, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. I can't believe it finally happened.
Yes, I hope that we can have more of these conversations so we can all have better sex.
Amen.
Amen.
Gay man. Thank you, Kimmy and Willy. You can find Kimmy on...
Yeah, you can find me on my website at kimmywoo.com or on Instagram under Asian Sex Therapist.
You can find me on Instagram. I'm pelvic floor galore.
Yay. Thank you, Kimmy and Willy.